There are voices in the grand cathedral of music history that ring out like bells, clear, triumphant, and impossible to ignore. They are the voices of legends, carved into the public consciousness. But then, in the quiet, dusty corners of that same cathedral, you might hear something else. A sound that isn't a bell, but a prayer whispered from a darkened pew. A voice that doesn't demand your attention, but rather earns it with a raw, unshakable honesty that can feel almost unnerving. This is the space inhabited by Karen Dalton. For those who have stumbled upon her music, the experience is often transformative. It's a sound that seems to bypass the ears and go straight to the soul, a voice that carries the weight of centuries of sorrow and resilience. It's been famously compared to the great Billie Holiday and the legendary Bob Dylan himself in the crucible of the Greenwich Village folk scene, called her his favorite singer. Yet while Dylan became the voice of a generation, Karen Dalton became its most treasured secret, a phantom presence whose life was a tangled tapestry of breathtaking talent, profound pain, and a stubborn refusal to play by anyone's rules but her own. Her story is not a simple rise and fall narrative. It is the story of a woman who was both a musical giant and a fragile human being, a force of nature who seemed to carry a storm inside her. Today, we're delving deep into the archives, piecing together the memories and the music to tell the full story of Karen Dalton, the ghost with the golden broken voice. To truly grasp the elemental power of Karen Dalton's music, one must first journey back to the landscapes that shaped her soul. Born Karen Jean Carricker in 1937 in Bonham, Texas, her formative years were spent in Enid, Oklahoma. This was a land still haunted by the memory of the Dust Bowl, a place where survival was etched into the faces of its people, and where resilience was not a choice, but a daily necessity. The Oklahoma of Karen's youth was a cultural crossroads, a place where the mournful melodies of Scots-Irish folk ballads mingled with the gritty realism of the country blues and the deep spiritual rhythms of the Native American traditions that ran through her own family's heritage. It's believed she was of Cherokee descent, and while the exact lineage is part of the family's private history, that sense of being an outsider, of belonging to an older, more wounded America, is a palpable presence in her art. Music in this environment wasn't an academic pursuit. It was functional, communal, and deeply ingrained in the fabric of life. It was the sound of the church, the field, and the front porch. This is where Karen first picked up a guitar, and later the long-necked banjo that would become her signature instrument. She learned to play not by reading music, but by listening and feeling, developing a distinctive, intuitive style. Her clawhammer banjo technique was hypnotic, and her 12-string guitar playing was a complex, rhythmic foundation for her soaring, aching vocals. She wasn't learning to perform, she was learning to communicate in her most natural language. However, her path was never destined to be a simple one. The romantic image of the carefree folk singer, leaving home with nothing but a guitar and a dream, simply does not apply to Karen Dalton. Her life was complicated by immense adult responsibilities from a shockingly young age. Before she turned 21, Karen had already been married twice and was the mother of 2 children. Her first marriage at 15 produced her son, John, and her second, to a man named Richard Tucker, gave her a daughter, Aberlin. This is the crucial, often overlooked preamble to her story. When she eventually made the fateful decision to head east, she wasn't a starry-eyed kid. She was a young woman fleeing a life that had already been marked by struggle, a mother caught between her fierce artistic spirit and the crushing weight of circumstance. The Ramblin' Girl persona she would later embody was not a bohemian affectation. It was a painful reality born of a desperate search for freedom, a search that would inevitably have profound and heartbreaking consequences for her family. In the early 1960s, drawn by the whispers of a cultural awakening, Karen Dalton arrived in Greenwich Village, New York City. The village at that moment was a world aflame with ideas. It was a chaotic, vibrant nexus for a generation disillusioned with the buttoned-down conformity of 1950s America. The air in coffee houses like the Gaslight Cafe and Café Wa was thick with cigarette smoke, radical politics, and the revolutionary sound of the American folk revival. Young musicians were digging up old ballads and blues numbers, treating them not as quaint relics, but as vital living documents of the American experience. They were searching for something real, something authentic, in a culture they felt had become increasingly artificial. Into this scene walked Karen Dalton, and to many she seemed like the very embodiment of the authenticity they were all striving for. She was no middle-class college student play acting as a Dust Bowl refugee. She was the real article. Tall with a striking, almost severe beauty, long dark hair, and an intense gaze, she had an undeniable presence. When she took the stage, often looking deeply uncomfortable, and began to sing, the chattering rooms would fall into a stunned silence. Her voice was an instrument of raw, unfiltered emotion. It wasn't always pretty in the conventional sense. It cracked, it strained, it sighed with a weariness that seemed to defy her years. But it was undeniably breathtakingly real. Bob Dylan, in his memoir Chronicles, Volume 1, famously recalled his awe. "My favorite singer in the place was Karen Dalton. Karen had a voice like Billie Holiday's and played guitar like Jimmy Reed. I sang with her a couple of times." Coming from Dylan, this was the ultimate seal of approval. The other musicians on the scene, from Fred Neil and Tim Hardin to the members of the Holy Modal Rounders, held her in similar esteem. They saw in her a direct, unbroken line to the very heart of the American musical tradition. She didn't just sing the blues, she seemed to exhale them. Yet this reverence from her peers existed in a tragic paradox with her own internal state. Karen was plagued by what can only be described as a crippling aversion to the machinery of performance. It went far beyond simple stage fright. She harbored a deep and profound distrust of the music industry and the very idea of commercializing her art. To her, music was a sacred, intimate exchange, something that happened in a living room among friends, not in a sterile recording studio under the cold, analytical gaze of an engineer. Peter Stamfel, her close friend from the Holy Modal Rounders, noted that she was fiercely intelligent and incredibly funny, but also possessed a terror of being recorded. This fear would become the defining obstacle of her career. While her contemporaries were signing record deals and appearing at folk festivals, Karen remained a creature of the shadows, a legend who seemed determined to resist her own legend. This profound reluctance is the entire backstory to her first album, 1969's It's So Hard to Tell Who's Going to Love You the Best. The album exists only through an act of loving deception. Nick Vennett, a producer at Capitol Records, brought her into the studio under the pretense that he was recording his own material and just wanted her to play along. He understood that a formal recording session would send her fleeing, so he created an environment that mimicked the informal jam sessions where she was most comfortable. The result is one of the most intimate and vulnerable debut albums ever made. It's a stark minimalist recording, capturing Karen with her 12-string guitar and banjo, her voice front and center, unadorned and achingly beautiful. The album was a commercial failure, a quiet whisper in a year dominated by the roar of Woodstock and Abbey Road. But for the few who heard it, it was a revelation, a secret passed from one music lover to another, like a precious, fragile heirloom. 2 years later, in 1971, the music world tried to embrace her one more time. Michael Lang, one of the co-creators of the Woodstock Festival, had started his own label, Just Sunshine Records, and he offered Karen a proper recording budget. She was set up at the legendary Bearsville Studios near Woodstock, a world-class facility. The producer was Harvey Brooks, a seasoned bassist who had played on Dylan's seminal Highway 61 Revisited. This was it, her chance to make the album she deserved, with the resources to match her talent. The resulting record was titled In My Own Time. The sessions for In My Own Time were, by all accounts, a mix of brilliance and chaos. Harvey Brooks assembled a stellar band, but coaxing performances out of Karen was a delicate, often frustrating process. She was still deeply uncomfortable in the studio environment, but the warmth of the Woodstock community and the patience of the musicians allowed her to create something truly magical. The album is more lush and arranged than her debut, with strings, horns, and a full rhythm section, but the production never overwhelms her. Instead, it creates a rich, soulful backdrop for her voice, which had grown even more powerful and nuanced. Her interpretation of Dino Valenti's Something on Your Mind is the album's emotional core, a performance of such devastating intimacy it feels like you're eavesdropping on a private moment of reckoning. When she sings, "Yesterday, anyway you made it was all right, so you made it," she stretches the syllables, imbuing the words with a lifetime of regret and resignation. Her version of the traditional ballad Katie Cruel, a song about a woman ostracized by her community, becomes, in Karen's hands, a defiant, heartbreaking anthem of female independence and sorrow. The album's iconic cover photo, showing Karen with her 2 children and a dog in the Colorado wilderness, adds another layer of meaning. It captures the paradox of her life, the free-spirited artist and the mother, the wanderer and the anchor, all existing within one complex human being. In My Own Time was a masterpiece. It received glowing reviews from critics who recognized its singular genius. But once again, the wider public failed to connect. The album sold poorly, and for Karen, it was the final straw. She had given the music industry 2 perfect, uncompromising pieces of her soul, and in return she had received little more than critical praise and commercial indifference. Utterly disillusioned, she did what she had always threatened to do. She walked away. She drifted out of the music scene, beginning a long, slow fade into a life of profound hardship and near total obscurity. This wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a quiet, heartbreaking surrender. The years following the release of In My Own Time constitute the most painful and mythologized chapter of Karen Dalton's life. This was her period of wandering, a slow, rootless drift that took her from the artistic enclaves of Colorado, where she briefly fell in with the hard-living circle of fellow musician Townes Van Zandt, back to the rural fringes of upstate New York. Her lifelong struggles with alcohol and heroin addiction, which had simmered beneath the surface even during her most creative periods, now took center stage. Without the structure of recording or the support of a consistent musical community, she fell deeper into a cycle of poverty and despair. This is where the debate over her life becomes most acute. Was she a tragic victim, a brilliant woman chewed up and spit out by a patriarchal music industry that had no room for her brand of uncompromising artistry? Or was she, as some have suggested, a difficult artist whose own self-destructive tendencies made a stable life and career impossible? The truth is a far more complex and sorrowful tapestry woven from threads of both. She was undeniably a victim of her time. The music industry of the 1960s and 70s was a notoriously brutal place for women who didn't fit into neat categories. She wasn't the sweet-voiced folk Madonna like Joan Baez, nor was she the rock goddess like Janis Joplin. She was something else entirely, something quieter and more complex, and the industry simply had no idea how to market her. At the same time, one cannot ignore the internal demons she battled. Her anxieties and fears were not affectations, they were real and debilitating. Her refusal to compromise was both her greatest artistic strength and her most profound personal liability. She valued her freedom, the freedom to live as she chose and to make music on her own terms, above all else. The demands of a music career, with its relentless touring, promotion, and schmoozing, felt like a gilded cage. For Karen, it was better to be free and destitute in the wilderness than to be a captive in the palace of pop stardom. Her life during this period descended into a state of extreme precarity. There were long stretches of homelessness. Her health, battered by years of hard living and neglect, began to fail. In a particularly cruel blow, an infection cost her most of her teeth. For a singer whose voice was her entire world, this was a devastating, silencing event. It wasn't just a physical loss, it was a loss of identity, pushing her further into isolation. The stories from these lost years are heartbreaking, tales of a generational talent reduced to a daily struggle for the most basic necessities. Yet even in this profound darkness, her spirit was not entirely vanquished. She was not utterly alone. A small, fiercely loyal circle of friends, like the avant-garde guitarist Peter Walker, did their best to look out for her. They found her places to stay, from remote cabins to spare rooms, providing a fragile safety net that likely kept her alive. And she never stopped being a musician. Though she could no longer perform publicly, the music was still inside her. It was a private language, a source of comfort she shared with the few people who remained in her life. She was a musician to her very core, even when the world was no longer listening. In the late 1980s, her long battle with her health entered its final, tragic phase. She was diagnosed with AIDS, contracted through intravenous drug use. This was at the height of the epidemic, a time when the diagnosis was not only a death sentence, but also a mark of extreme social stigma. For the last years of her life, she lived in a mobile home in Hurley, New York, not far from Woodstock, the site of her last great artistic effort. She was cared for by Peter Walker, who ensured her final days were spent with a measure of peace and dignity. On March 19th, 1993, Karen Dalton died from an AIDS-related illness. She was 55 years old. Her passing went largely unnoticed by the wider world. There were no front-page obituaries, no televised tributes. The quiet, haunting voice of the village had finally fallen silent. For nearly a decade after her death, Karen Dalton's story seemed destined to be a cautionary footnote, her name known only to the most dedicated record collectors and the musicians who had once stood in her shadow. Her 2 albums were long out of print, beautiful artifacts lost to time. But the most powerful art has a way of refusing to be forgotten. Ghosts, after all, can be persistent. In the early 2000s, a remarkable resurrection began. A new generation of artists, many of whom weren't even born when she recorded her last album, started discovering her work. The independent record label Light in the Attic, known for its lovingly curated reissues of forgotten classics, re-released both It's So Hard to Tell Who's Going to Love You the Best and In My Own Time on CD and vinyl. For the first time in 30 years, her music was available to a global audience. And this time, the world was finally ready to listen. The response was a slow-building wave of acclaim. Musicians like Nick Cave, Lucinda Williams, Joanna Newsom, Devendra Banhart, and Angel Olsen began to champion her work, citing her as a foundational influence. Nick Cave, an artist who knows a thing or two about channeling darkness into beauty, wrote powerfully about her, calling her my favorite female blues singer and praising the raw, untamed nature of her voice. Her songs began to appear in films and television shows, her haunting melodies providing the perfect emotional shorthand for moments of profound sorrow and bittersweet beauty. In 2020, the acclaimed documentary Karen Dalton, In My Own Time, meticulously crafted from rare archival recordings, home movies, and the intimate recollections of friends and family, brought her full story to light. The film beautifully separated the complex, often funny and fiercely intelligent woman from the one-dimensional myth of the tragic folk singer. The legacy of Karen Dalton is, therefore, a story of two lives, the one she lived and the one her music is living now. The first life was undeniably filled with tragedy, a heartbreaking saga of missed opportunities, personal demons, and a world that wasn't ready for her genius. But her second life, her posthumous life, is a story of profound and undeniable triumph. It is the triumph of an art so pure and powerful that it could survive decades of neglect to find its audience. By any conventional metric, Karen Dalton was not a success. She didn't sell records, she didn't win awards, she didn't achieve fame, but her work endures because it possesses a quality that is rarer and more valuable than any of those things: an absolute, unshakable authenticity. In our modern age of auto-tuned vocals, social media branding, and algorithm-driven art, Karen Dalton's music is a potent antidote. It is a mainline to something visceral and real. It's the sound of a human heart beating, breaking, and somehow still singing. Her life was a testament to the fact that our greatest strengths and our deepest wounds often come from the same place. The very sensitivity that allowed her to create such profound music also made it impossible for her to navigate the harsh realities of the world. But in the end, the art outlived the pain. She was the ghost at the feast, the secret voice of a generation. And while her time on earth was tumultuous and far too short, her legacy is a powerful reminder that some voices are not meant to be monuments. They are meant to be embers, glowing quietly in the dark, waiting for us to lean in closer and feel their warmth. Karen Dalton is no longer a ghost. She is an ancestor, and her time has finally come. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.